Good evening. I'm Clarence Reynolds, Director at the Center for Black Literature at Medgar Evers College. I want to welcome you all to this evening's John Oliver Killens reading series program, A Conversation with Danielle Evans and Jocelyn Nicole Johnson. This evening's program brings together two fantastic authors who have written riveting short story collections. We are delighted to have them both with us this evening to share with you their writing, what inspires them, and their thoughts about the short story art form. Each writer will begin by reading an excerpt from their short story collection. They will then share their reflections on their writing and their stories. We want to hear from you, the audience members, as well. So after they finish their conversation, I will then moderate a Q&A with you. So please go to the Q&A section on your screen and you can list your questions there. But before we begin with Jocelyn and with Danielle, I want to thank our partners, the Amazon Literary Partnership and the African American Literature Book Club, for helping us bring this program together. I now want to introduce Dr. Brenda Green, Director of the Center for Black Literature. Dr. Green is a scholar, educational leader, author, literary activist, and radio host. She is a professor of English, founder and executive director at the Center for Black Literature, and the director of the National Black Writers Conference at Medgar Evers College. Dr. Green's educational leadership, professional accomplishments, and scholarship include essays, grants, book reviews, and presentations in African American literature, composition, and multicultural literature. She is the editor of African Presence and Influence on the Cultures in the Americas, and co-editor of Resistance and Transformation, Conversations with Black Writers. Dr. Brenda Green.
Thank you so much, Clarence, and welcome and greetings to the Killens reading series. Welcome to our writers, Danielle Evans, the author of the Office of Historical Corrections, and Jocelyn Nicole Johnson, the author of My Monticello, a Fiction. Welcome, Medgar Evers College community. Welcome, faculty, students, and staff. Welcome, friends of Medgar Evers College. Welcome, our Center for Black Literature board members. We could not do this without the support of all of you. I'd like to acknowledge our supporters and partners who helped to promote this event, who include the Franklin Park Reading Series, the Brooklyn Public Library, Dr. Dana Williams from Howard University, the Medgar Evers College Office of Communications, the Medgar Evers College Office of Academic Affairs, and the CUNY Office of Communications. We also could not do this without the Center for Black Literature staff and consultants, who include Clarence Reynolds, who you just heard from, the director of the center, Amber Magruder, the project manager for the center, April Silver, the marketing and communications director, Leah Bird, the communications and marketing associate, Simone Weil Manning, our virtual events manager, Donna Hill, our fiction workshop leader, and Brooklyn Book Festival liaison. Thank you so much. I'd like to acknowledge our VP, Jesse Kane, who is in the audience, Senior Vice President for Success and Student Enrollment. We are pleased that we're going to be celebrating the Center for Black Literature, which was founded in 2002. We'll be celebrating it in 2022. And our mission is to ensure that the work and the voices of writers from the African diaspora are sustained and promoted. We celebrate and acknowledge writers through our programming, such as the National Black Writers Conference and Biennial Symposia, the John Oliver Killens Reading Series, which is what we're hosting today, the Killens Review of Arts and Letters, our journal, the Dr. Edith Rock Writers Workshop for Elder Writers, the Writers on Writing radio program, which airs over WNYE and which is archived on our website and in YouTube, the Center for Black Literature Book Club, and our youth program, Re-envisioning Our Lives Through Literature. We also encourage students from Medgar Evers College to submit blogs on our website. It's called Student Musings. I encourage you to visit the Center for Black Literature website at www.centerforblackLiterature.org to get more information about all of our programming. And as was mentioned, we are so pleased to hear from two writers who have written short stories and novellas which address themes such as race relations, white supremacy, police brutality, immigration, and colorism. Using race as a critical lens, they weave stories that readily engage us and explore the complex relations of Blacks in our current society. They create worlds where a Black man decides to conduct an experiment on his son. A woman escapes white supremacists and leads a neighborhood of primarily Black people to the Thomas Jefferson home in Charlottesville, Virginia. Two Black women join an organization dedicated to correcting the historical and contemporary myths and inaccuracies that we are bombarded with in a media-driven culture that does not value integrity and truth in all of its messaging. A man tries to correct the unlawful imprisonment of his grandfather at the famous prison in Alcatraz. These and other stories reflect recent movements while providing alternative representations of Blacks in the history of our country. As the reviewers of their book state, they have mastered the short story and they know how to engage and garner sympathy from their readers. So I thank you once again for joining us and for your support. You support writers by purchasing their books, and you support our booksellers by buying books from our Black booksellers. I encourage you to visit the bookseller, the African American Literature Book Club, which you will see in the chat, aalbc.com. And I encourage you also to go to the Center for Black Literature website and to donate to the center. Your donations, no matter the amount, help to sustain our programming. So stay tuned for a stimulating discussion on the art of the short story with writers who are telling our stories in bold and imaginative ways. Thank you so much.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Dr. Green. It's first my pleasure to introduce Danielle Evans. As Dr. Green mentioned, Danielle Evans is the author of the short story collection, The Office of Historical Corrections. She's also the author of Before You Suffocate Your Own Fool Self, winner of the 2021 Joyce Carol Oates Prize, the PEN America Robert Wynne Bingham Prize, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and the Patterson Prize, and a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree. Her stories have appeared in many magazines and anthologies, including the Best American Short Stories. Danielle teaches in the writing seminars at Johns Hopkins University. It's now my pleasure to introduce Danielle Evans, who's going to share her reading for us. Thank you, Danielle.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Thank you for having us both, and thank you all for being here on a Thursday night. I'm just going to read from the beginning of one of the short stories in the collection. It's called Alcatraz. You shouldn't need any context for the story because I'm going to start at the beginning. But we were asked to talk a little bit about the book. So I will say that I think one of the recurring questions of this collection, and I'm sure Jocelyn and I will talk a lot more about how things recur or come up again in a collection thematically, but the questions I thought about over and over again in this book were, how do we revisit the past, and what does it do to a story to both come back to it from a different vantage point, but also particularly to think about who it belongs to and what happens if you imagine the same story but change who you think the protagonist is. So I'm just going to read the very beginning of the story, Alcatraz. Everyone had told me that Alcatraz was nothing but a tourist trap, but I was desperate that summer for anything that would give my mother a sense of closure. And it seemed fortuitous that the person that had opened all the wounds in the first place was right in the middle of the water I could see from the window of my new apartment. I hadn't come to the bay on purpose. A string of coincidences and a life I hadn't known I'd wanted until I got there brought me to Oakland. Still, almost since the day I had arrived, it seemed like the only thing keeping me from the island was deliberate avoidance. I felt like I'd gotten it backward. Everyone else I'd met who'd come to California from the East Coast was running away from something. and I'd gone and gotten so close to the sting of the past that it sometimes seemed like I could touch it. I had come west to work in an experimental after-school theater and dance therapy program for children who had been abused. A friend I'd gone to college with spent months recruiting me, sending me literature about the program, smiling children's faces, photographs of the Bay and the Pacific. I was sold on the adventure, on the postcard perfect water, specific shade of blue. But by the time I said yes, she'd decided to move to Texas to begin a PhD program. I went anyway. I was 24 and convinced the life in which I made some critically important difference to everyone around me could start on my command, that the world was only waiting to know what I asked of it. I was anxious and exhausted all the time then, but I remember those days now as being filled with optimism, a sense of possibility. The organization's budget was so strained that our supervisors worked for free some months when we were between grants. I made ends meet tutoring and doing SAT prep for kids in Berkeley and Marin County. 2 of our college student volunteers quit after working at the center for less than a week. One of them had her cell phone stolen and the other was cursed out by 4 different kids in 3 different languages. My own first week on the job, a child had threatened to stab me with a pencil, but by and large, I loved the work I did, the crayon drawings and earnest thank you letters I got to pin to my wall, the way kids who used to greet me with skittishness at best, open contempt and hostility at worst, started running to hug me when I walked through the door. My mother had never been to the West Coast and didn't like that I was there. We were East Coast people, and this coast had done us wrong, almost kept us from existing. My great-grandfather had done time here, had been kept in the basement of Alcatraz, and been told every day that when he was dead, they would feed him to the rats. He was 18 then, finally of legal age to be in the army, except he'd been in it 3 years already, thanks to a falsified birth certificate. It was 1920, and Alcatraz was still a military prison, infamous not for its gangsters, but among would-be deserters. They were still building the parts of the prison that would later be immortalized, but it was already enough of a prison to be Charles Sullivan's private hell, the one he never really left, the one my mother, God bless her, was still trying to redeem. My mother was born nearly 4 decades later, born at all because after 2 years, the army, with the help of his appointed lawyer, admitted their mistake. They cleared him of murder and told him he was free to go. He took the long way back to the Bronx, spent years trying to make himself homes in inhospitable places. When he finally arrived back in New York, he married Louise, the first woman who took pity on him. And they had 2 children, the younger of whom was my grandmother. I never met her. She left a few months after my mother, a brown girl in a white family, was born. When my mother was 6, a neighbor told her to her face that her own mother was too ashamed to stay in the house and claim her. After she came home crying, Charlie Sullivan pricked his finger and then hers and pressed them together and said they had the same blood now, and whatever she was, he was too. But my mother was too young to have heard of the 1-drop rule, and the intention was lost on her until years later. My mother called her grandparents Grammy and Papa. Grammy was firmly assigned the role of grandparent because they all chose to believe her mother might return someday, but Papa was her everything. When she was 13, her grandma died, and my mother belatedly came to appreciate what she had done while alive, squirreled away money before Papa spent it, saw to it that the rent was paid and the heat was on, and everyone in the house had clean clothes and 3 meals a day, and that her husband stayed sober enough to work, except when he had the prison nightmares and had to be kept drunk enough not to wake the neighbors with screams. At 18, my mother left home for college. She only went as far as Jersey, but her grandfather was dead within 2 years of her going. It wouldn't occur to me until well into my adulthood, most of it spent in California, a full country away from her, to question my mother's conviction that the former event had caused the latter, or to wonder what she wanted me to do with a cautionary tale in which the caution was against growing up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. That was fantastic. I'd now like to introduce, it's now my pleasure to introduce Jocelyn, Jocelyn Nicole Johnson. Jocelyn is the author of the critically acclaimed My Monticello, a fiction debut which was called Electrifying by Colson Whitehead, and a masterly feat by the New York Times. A fellow of Tin House, Hedgebrook, and the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, Johnson's writing has appeared in Guernica, The Guardian, Quelle Journal, and elsewhere. Her short story, Control Negro, was anthologized in the Best American Short Stories 2018, which was guest edited by Roxane Gay, who described the story as one hell of a story. And the story was also read by LeVar Burton for PRI's Selected Shorts. A veteran public school art teacher, Jocelyn now lives and writes in Charlottesville, Virginia. Please welcome Jocelyn Nicole Johnson.
No. Sorry about that. I couldn't get my video to come on, everybody. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I want to thank the Center for Black Fiction for having me. And I'm so excited to talk to Danielle Evans. So My Monticello is a collection of 5 stories and a novella. And the novella's gotten a lot of focus because it is the majority of the story, the majority of the book. It's a story of a group of neighbors who live in Charlottesville, Virginia, who are forced to flee violent, marauding white supremacists, kind of in a near future time that could be now, could be really close to now, and end up taking refuge in the nearby plantation home of Thomas Jefferson, led by an imagined descendant of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. But I actually want to read something a little bit from another story. I'm going to read from the slimmest story in the collection, a story called Buying a House Ahead of the Apocalypse. And this is really just a story of a single mother who is contemplating a big birthday. She's thinking about what it would be like to own her first home, while also kind of thinking about this idea of collapse, of apocalypse, whether it be, and we don't know how much of it is real. So I'm going to read just a few minutes from that story. The only thing you really need to know is that the story takes place in the form of a list. So it's little bullets. Buying a house ahead of the apocalypse. Scour online listings daily. Find a house ahead of your 40th, ahead of your imminent doom. Never mind that a house is an investment, a belief that things on the whole will get better. Find a house on a hill set back from the road, a sturdy brick rancher or a quaint bungalow that needs work. Search outside of Richmond, not too far from the city, since baby girl's still finishing art school here. Keep up your commute, rising before dawn to burn up the road to Williamsburg. Never mind the long drive, the lights you've left on, the busted toilet your landlord won't fix, which is always, always running. Put a thumb on the scale for any location named for, but not in truth near a broad body of water. Appomattox Drive, James River Road, Chesapeake Way. Try again for that gated subdivision, the one with the outlier security booth, its zebraed boom barrier blocking the entrance. That flimsy arm of protection that could soon shield you and baby girl from the flaring world. Never mind the dark-skinned guard who wouldn't even let you in after you failed to produce the flyer for the so-called open house. Catch the older lady in the credit union, the one with the smoldering accent, the one who makes the loans, the one who reminds me of your own mother, if your ma had been brown and Latina instead of Black with an uhuru do hailing from Carolina. Wear your hair bone straight, a fresh weave with the tight itch of cornrows beneath, like something true but hidden. Tell the older bank lady you're earning more than ever. No need to mention it's a third as much as anyone else at your office, which you know because you manage their books. Confide there's a blazing cake birthday on your horizon. Ask her, for real, what can she do for you? Check your credit score with that app on your phone when you bolt awake in the middle of the night. Scroll to see how swiftly the Amazon burns. Scroll to see how many hundreds of species have been lost or consumed within the last 24 hours. Scroll to see which items you've saved in your cart, primed to ship at your beck and call. Check to see if baby girl has written back, and make sure your ex, your long ago ex, her father, remains out west with all those states like a bulwark between you. Scroll through his newly posted pics, a fresh 22-year-old under his arm, her cherry pout, her mocking lashes, her doe wet eyes, Her gaze veers like yours used to, betraying that same ember of dread. Flip the phone on the bed sheets to dampen its glare and stare up at the blackened ceiling. Lift your phone again, refresh to see what might have changed. That's the end of my reading.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. We really appreciate that. Before we begin the conversation with Jocelyn and Danielle, I want to welcome Mr. Richard Wesley in the audience, who's one of our Center for Black Literature Advisory Board members. He was also one of the honorees at last year's National Black Writers Conference. Welcome, Richard. Glad to have you join us. So, ladies and gentlemen, Jocelyn and Danielle, take it away, ladies.
Hi, Danielle.
It's so nice to see you, and congratulations on all of the sort of well-deserved success this book is having. Actually, I don't know. I was hoping that I could start because I have a question that's kind of about the story you read, although it's part of a bigger question. I know that one of my favorite things about a story collection is that it lets you both revisit the same question in lots of different ways, and also lets you do really different things, like things you might not be able to sustain for a whole novel or wouldn't want to. So one of the things that struck me in looking at the stories in your book is the sort of formal experimentation and play that a lot of the stories allow you, that sometimes you sort of lean into a conceit that, and then complicate that conceit in these really interesting ways. When I teach my point of view class, I tell my students there are 4 types of second person, and I think you have like 2 or 3 of them in your stories in this book, and you use it to like really different effect. So I guess I wanted to start by asking you where the pleasure was in this collection in both kind of coming at the same questions in different ways, and also in doing things that felt playful, that the shorter space gave you room to sort of experiment with in these kinds of stories where you're taking these risks, kind of how you arrived at them and how they fit together for you.
Yeah, well, I'll thank you. I'll pop off on that idea of just, within this collection, there are different voices. There's a story that is in the form of a letter. There's definitely a couple, at least, this story, this list that is in second person. There's another story that is straight in second person, like almost a story, Virginia's Not Your Home, where the main character's almost admonishing herself. She's saying, do this, don't do that. She's kind of looking at her life through this lens. I really like form, and I don't know why I ended up being someone who always is kind of pushing at these different forms or looking for them. But I often, the form that a story has for me just really fits with the idea of the story. And I'm a compulsive list maker. So this one is probably the story that's closest to my own heart and the way that I think. This idea of trying to contain really small and intimate things in a list alongside like your kind of greatest fears and all the complicated and messed up things about yourself. So this person's making this list and she's talking about, possibly the end of civilization, but then at the same time, she's like, but how am I going to wear my hair for that time? She has this idea of like wanting to, wanting things, just being very human and wanting comfort, even as she sees how the things she wants are contributing to this, idea of loss. So yeah, I wrote this collection while being a full-time teacher, while doing a lot of other things. And so I love that space you have when you're doing something else and then you come back to a new story and you have kind of a fresh point of view, and that story might call for something very different. In the novella, I really wrote in a straight first person narrative because it just suited that. It's almost like written in the moment. So that's what I have to say about that right now. How do you think about form? Like, how do you think about the shape of your stories, or do you think about it? Does it just kind of arise from what you're doing? Like, is it something that because I don't set out to say, oh, I'm going to write a second person story. It just comes out of the story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I'm the same way. I tend not to know what I'm doing on a first draft, and I try not to know what I'm doing. I think I let myself get to the end of the story before I try to decide what it is. And so when I get to the end of a first draft, I always ask myself what the story's operating questions are, and And I think of those in kind of, I used to say two questions, but I think really it's two categories of questions. I think about what the immediate questions of the story are. So what the sort of narrative or plot concerns are, or the thing that I've sort of promised to the reader I will resolve, which I either have to resolve or give them something unexpected but more satisfying than the question they thought I was answering. And then I think of the questions I don't want to answer, the sort of thematic questions that I hope will keep the reader up at night or will allow the characters to have some imagined life off the page in which people might wonder what happens next, or think about what decisions they'll make as a consequence of this. And so once I get to those questions, then I go back and revise structurally. And I think because I don't think about revision until I can finish a draft, it's rare that I will radically change something like the voice or point of view. It's happened a couple times. Sometimes I just haven't realized that, like, you know, in a first draft, I have this sort of messy shifting between points of view or tenses sometimes, and I have to go back and pick one and clean it up. But most of the time, if I can get to the end of the story, I've figured out whose story it is. And so it's just a question of, then I go back and revise structurally, and then I go back and revise sentence level. And then I go back and kind of spot check things. But usually once I've gotten far enough into the story to be able to answer those questions about it, the story sort of already figured out for me what it is.
I definitely try to write through a whole draft as well. I think it's really hard to start to check yourself until you get through that space, and kind of, it tells you, like what you said, by the end you can see where it's going. I often have to go back and think about the middle. You know, often I'll have a really strong image at the beginning, and then I know I find where I'm kind of going. It may shift some, and then that middle piece I often find I have to go back and think about. How do you, so one thing I was thinking about with, I often really write in reaction to things in the real world. And I was curious, in both your collections, just how do you start, like, what is the starting point for you? How do you come to a story? How does it, you know, what kind of gets you going to begin with, to know, you know, to set off? Or is it just habit of sitting there and what comes?
Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, I'm always wrestling with ideas. And I think when something starts to feel urgent, like, oh, I need to sit down and map this out or write it right now, is when two things that didn't seem connected start to feel connected to me somehow. And then I have to sort of write my way into what that connection is. And so sometimes those are images, sometimes those are characters, sometimes it's a very clear voice and then a question that I'm not sure how it's related to that voice. But usually it's somehow two separate things that I'm writing to somehow connect. I rarely respond literally to the world, but then I'm a really slow writer. So sometimes the world catches up to me. Like, my book was in galleys, and sort of there's a novella in my book, and I want to talk about the novellas in both of our collections, but there's a long novella at the end of my book that begins with this kind of correction about the history of Juneteenth. And it was already in galleys this summer that sort of Trump made his comment about Juneteenth, and then it was suddenly all over the news that everyone was making this correction. And I was like, oh no, now this story is gonna read like ripped from the headlines. And it happens to me all the time. And I just try to take a deep breath and say, like, but is this story really about this? Like, this is an example of this, the story's sort of larger question. So it doesn't actually matter if people think that it was written later than it was. But my problem is I'm like a little bit psychic. So if this whole fiction thing fails, I'm gonna go for Miss Cleo's lane, but not enough to like be way ahead of time. So I think that the big operative question that comes across in a lot of the stories in my new collection, and I think I also, I don't want to speak for you, but I feel it as a reader in your collection, is how to, the question you just asked in that story, right? How to live when you're not sure about the future, which is also a question about how to be an artist, right? Like, why am I taking 10 years on a book when I'm like not sure we have a planet or like a democracy in which Black people can survive in 10 years? And there's a certain kind of optimism it takes to do the kind of long work of fiction that doesn't feel fitted to the world that we live in. And I think one of the ways to write through that is to lean into the question, is to say, well, okay, well, what do I believe in, or what is going to keep me going, or what am I living for, or what would it look like to live through my worst fear? And so I think there are not necessarily intentionally responsibly, but just sort of emotionally in terms of where I was for the 10 years of both really personal anxiety and grief and kind of a larger grief and anxiety about the planet and the country, is obviously kind of marking my book in a way that connects the stories. And I feel like it's also kind of marking and connecting your book. Is that something that's intentional? Is that something that just emerged from the world being as it is? And do you have an answer for how to write through the apocalypse? Because I really need one.
Well, it's so fun. I mean, I think that story for me was, I was kind of paralyzed by fear of like, why bother? And it kind of wrote me in a weird way through that fear, totally illogically, because the issues are all still there, and if not, maybe worse. But there's this way in which I kind of fantasize and hope that if I can put it on the page and have it be in the world, then you all have to worry about it with me, and it's not just mine. You know, the things that keep me awake at night and that bother me and agitate me are often a place where I start my fiction, and they can be really small and intimate things, but they can also be these bigger things. And so I definitely was, I relate to that idea of, I don't know, just exploring questions, and it's not even using it that way. It's just the way that I think and I am. And it's funny because I know it is a little gauche and ripped from the headlines, but I really do often write about things that are really happening right now to me. But it's only things that feel intimate in a way, even if they're big events. I really thought in this collection about writing about place, about Virginia, about Charlottesville, but kind of just through, hopefully through, I don't know, just kind of a odd point of view. That's my point of view. You know, I like the way you said too that you don't, you know, all of this is filtered through you and your lens and what you're seeing in the world. And so it often just, by being an artist and by being a person in time and space, there's going to be this sense of connection. Because if you're thinking about grief, if you're thinking about loss, if you're noticing violence towards Black people, whatever it is, those things are going to find their way into the stories, regardless of where you start in these big and small ways. So.
Question about Virginia, but it's not going to sound like I'm asking about Virginia for a long time, but I'm going to get there, I promise. So I'm looking at your beautiful necklace. Jocelyn also sent me this wonderful Virginia magnet, which I put on my refrigerator in the state of Maryland, which is probably illegal, but I was born in Alexandria, so they'll have to give me an allowance for that. But I'm interested in place in the short story in particular, because one of the reasons I love a short story is because of its density. I think that a short story has to kind of hit its marks in a compressed space. And one of the ways that often works is through the compression of time. That I think about the moments when I'm most emotionally moved by a story. And they're often the places in a story where the past, present, and future are sometimes happening all at once, right? Where somehow we're present in the immediate moment, but we're also accessing some kind of memory, and we're also accessing either an actual glimpse of the future or an anxiety about the future. And somehow that makes the feeling feel bigger than the page. And I think that one of the best ways to ground that movement in time sometimes is place, because a place suggests something about what it is, but it also always kind of holds the ghost of what it was. And it also isn't always, and everything is always in flux. So there's always some gesture toward what's coming or what's looming or in what way a place is transforming. Whether for better or for worse, or both at once, or sometimes thinking it's one thing, but it's actually the other. And so because your work is so intimately connected to place, I'm wondering how you think about place in fiction, and also because Virginia is so many things at once and so many kind of fluctuating things all at the same time, whether that's kind of a source of material for you, how it sort of appears differently in your work from story to story.
Yeah, I mean, Virginia is super diverse. I mean, there's this way in which, so in my family, I'm the only person who was born in Virginia. My parents and my brother were all born in South Carolina, so I have like all the South Carolina cousins, and that's like my other home away from home. Like my parents would drive home to South Carolina and then they drive back home to Virginia. So I had this kind of duality of home, but Virginia had this kind of sense of being unequivocally mine. I grew up in Northern Virginia. I really related to the stories in your first collection because there was just a sense of that place. There was something about that. But at any rate, and I went to school in the Shenandoah Valley. I thought all these like kind of, and Virginia is so diverse. Like, you know, we have my sister-in-law's like Hampton Roads area. We have this whole different like geography. And then there's not to even speak of the history of Virginia. And now I live in Charlottesville. I've lived here for about 20 years and taught school here for a really long time. And so there's a way in which I kind of thought for a really long time that Virginia was kind of unequivocally mine. It's just like, it's just, you live in the state, it's yours. But for me, some of the recent events that have happened here in Charlottesville just made me kind of it's not that I didn't know that America has all the problems it does, but really rethink about what is the actual history of this place and how is it affecting me now? I mean, I think there's a way that within our families and other structures, we know what happened to us in our family life. We know that that history shapes us. It's very apparent if you're an adult, you're like, oh yeah, this happened and I feel this way. But I think with like bigger history movements and with place, we're not always aware, even if we're aware in our bodies, we don't always like attend to the detail. We don't always have in the front of our mind how those things are operating. So I guess I wanted to play with the idea of not only just the physical geography and this variety of places, but this idea of how the history that's here, this unseen history, this buried history is affecting these characters in the contemporary world now, both their history and their lives and the way that also the history of, you know, of their ancestors and before. So just thinking about kind of that tension was something that was interesting to me.
We promised to talk, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, no, go.
I was just saying we promised to talk about novellas. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that form. I mean, I think I know that as much as I love the story form and as much as I love the story form in part because I think it has more capacity sometimes than people give it credit for, that you can fit a lot into a short story if you're willing to kind of give up the right things and think about what work the subterranean part of the story can do for you. But I did feel like I needed more room for the novella in part because I had to do some slightly complicated world building in which it was sort of like a near future, but one that wasn't exactly the future of this world, though those were sort of a very closely adjacent ones. So I had to make some decisions about what the world building rules would be, and then I had to sort of put them into play and also do the character work. And I felt like that needed more space than an average short story would take. But I also felt that by the time I got there to the novella, I understood that it was a version of what I'd been thinking about with all the other stories in the book. And so it never really felt like its own project. It didn't feel like it could be kind of untethered from the rest of the work. And so because you've also written a book where a lot of the book is this sort of one novella, I wonder, did you always know this was one book? Was there ever a point at which you thought, oh, this is a novel, and then realized it belonged to this other work? How did it come to be that this was a collection and that you understood that all of these pieces needed to be in conversation and were sort of greater than the sum of their parts together?
I mean, I'm so happy that it's together because I think there's a way in which, like you said, the themes that run throughout, that one story points to another, that one idea expounds on another. I mean, I was looking, I read your collection when it came out, but I was rereading the first story last night, and I was thinking about just how some of the themes of history and that, you know, in the Titanic ship and so forth and happily ever after, I hadn't realized how closely they related. I mean, I'd felt it through reading it, but how closely they related to the novella and some of the other stories. But at any rate, the novella could stand alone. I mean, it's going to come out, it could stand alone, but I love the way that it points to the other things. I love that idea that when you're reading Virginia is Not Your Home, the second story, that line comes up in the novella as well. I think that they're stronger for it. And I like the idea that it resists that one of these stories is the story or this is the real perspective, because they in ways things contradict one another. You have characters that come up against, you know, it creates a sense of complication and nuance between this perspective and this one. A question's answered and then it's unanswered elsewhere. I mean, I really appreciate that. I love short story collections for that reason, especially when they are really thematically related because I don't know, I just think they push and pull the reader in these really interesting ways that I appreciate and that I really enjoy in reading. So for me, I knew I liked seeing them together. I knew that I could pull apart the one, but I would say even for me, the novella, and I wonder if you feel the same for yours, even though there's a way that it still uses a lot of the conventions of short stories. There's a way that, you know, that it doesn't tie up, not that every novel ties up every loose end, but there's a sense of completion, like this kind of sense of pulling in, and it's just in the moment, and there's an openness and there's space that you have to be left with to think about what you think is going to come for it. You know, short stories often can end on an image in a way, and I think that worked better for what I hope to do in that particular story. And so it feels more like a, you know, novella, not just in the sense that it's briefer, but just in the way that it is going to, you know, leave the reader. And I wondered about that because, you know, Office of Historical Corrections came out some months before, a while before my novel, but we have a very similar format in just the shape of having that big novella at the end and having these stories that lead up to it. So how did you end up selling, like, did you know that novella was that like the last thing? Did you know that that's where it belonged?
Once it was done, you know, there was a point at which, in terms of order, and maybe we can talk a little bit about sort of organizing the collection as a collection. There was a point at which I thought it was going to go in the middle of the book. And I said, I was saying this to a colleague, they said, it's going to go in the middle. I had to think about that because I think that I had thought of it as a dividing moment. I liked what you said about a novella having sometimes the sort of energy of a short story. I think that also feels true to me, that I think that a short story, I don't know, this isn't like a definitive rule, so I'm sure that somewhere a novelist is going to want to fight me because I've said something didactic about the novel again, but I think there's something really interesting about the way that a short story, its center of gravity usually shifts toward the end, right? That when you get to the place where you realize what a short story was actually about all along, it's usually just about over. And I think that novellas often work that way too. And novels, I think, kind of reinvent themselves. Like every time you think you know what the novel's about, it introduces a new question or it tells you it can do something else. And I'm not saying that no short stories work that way or no novels work the other way, but I think that might be why the novella felt to me like it belonged to the short story. It was operating on a kind of short story's emotional logic, just with more pages. And I think that it was about kind of excavating or confronting the thing that was underneath all along. And once you get there, that's kind of where the story leaves you in that space of confrontation. It's a kind of roundabout process because there was a way in which the novella came from a novel that I was working on, and then I kind of started it over and realized that it was a novella and that it belonged to these short stories. And then once I understood what it was, I could borrow some pieces from the thing that I've been working on. But I think once I understood what it was, I'd already finished the rest of the stories in the collection. And so it became a way of, I think, really explicitly asking the question about history that a lot of the other work was asking implicitly. And I think I didn't quite understand what my book was about until I wrote the second to last thing I wrote, which is not the second to last thing in the order of the stories, but the second to last story I wrote, which is called Why Won't Women Just Say What They Want? But it's kind of a weird outlier. I had a whole speech because I was prepared to fight for it because I was sure that someone was going to try to make me cut it from the book at some point. And no one ever did. So I had all these talking points. I was like ready to fight somebody for it, but I didn't have to. But it's sort of, even though it's a kind of weird story in the space of the book, it made clear to me what the recurring questions of the collection actually were. And I think once I got there and I understood that, I understood how to come at those questions in the shape of the novella, and I could sort of let it be its own thing, and then also understood what to borrow from the material that I had sort of been working on and abandoned in this other longer project. But I'm curious about organizing a collection, because you mentioned the first story in my book, and I think I heard 3 other short story writers give some version of this answer, but I know that I've heard Lauren Groff and Laura Vandenberg give it, that the first story in a collection feels like it contains the most pieces of the other stories, right? That if you think of a story collection like, I don't know, like an overlapping series of Venn diagrams, right? That everything kind of is in conversation with at least one other thing, but also has some territory that just belongs to it. So there's some connection between the stories, but none of them wholly overlap. But the first story would be the one in the center, right? It would be the one that connects to the most other things because you're sort of trying to introduce the book to the reader. You're trying to introduce what it can do, and then complicate that in some way by going in different directions than the other stories, sometimes, as you said, contradictory directions. So I think I thought a lot about the first and last story. And then in the middle, usually I'm just trying not to put things that are either too jarring or too close together. And so sometimes it's just kind of like fitting a puzzle together once I have those first and last pieces in place. I wondered how you thought about organizing the stories in your collection, or how you think about story order as a reader in a collection.
Yeah, well, first I just want to say, I love how you were talking about how the meaning comes last, or as you get to the last story, you were more explicitly aware of what your questions were and how that informed however you both organize it and how you shape that last story, because I think for me, that's true. And I also absolutely love that idea. I think there's a way that short stories kind of build to that moment. There's a moment, like whenever I see the end of the story, the space at the end of the story, I know that there's going to be this kind of energy in that I really love. And I think that is both true for the novellas and the stories that we talked about. But as far as ordering stories, I had heard you say, I think on your birthday Zoom that I so admired when your book came out, that idea of the first story containing, you know, some reference or some broad way connecting, being a connective piece, so that as the reader went through that, they, even if they don't know it, even if they go to the second story, it's very different. There's all these threads that are pulling back to the first story. And I think that is probably true. With me, I had, you know, it's only 5 other stories besides the novella. They're really slim stories. They're really short. And I also noticed that often the story that's the inaugural story is one that really is just so commanding of the attention of the reader, and so introduces voice and so draws you in. It's like this invitation into the collection. And I mean, I think that's often true. I almost always remember the first story in a collection. I mean, part of it is just you're just hit with that person's voice for the first time. So there's something so new and wonderful about it. But there's also a way I think people place, if I wanted you to read one thing, this would be the thing that I want you to see first as an invitation into the things I'm going to say. And I think that was true for me as I thought about placing Control Negro at the beginning. I just think it's a story that I have all kinds of feelings about. It's a very strange story. I asked my writer group, I was like, should I show this to anyone ever? That was my first thought about that story. But there's something about it that I think, you know, it's just a series of questions that I have about how to be a parent, how to protect your child, how to navigate some of the psychological damage of racism or of a violence or a history that you have. And so there's all these things that I was thinking about that kind, and also maybe because it contained some of those themes, that was a story that that I don't know. I felt like that was like just the first thing to say, you know. And then also thinking about, like you said, that varying of themes, so that I had all these different kinds of voices. So I didn't want to put like a second person voice next to a second person voice. I wanted this sense of variety, so that as you move through the collection, it kind of slides. One writer, Nane Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, was saying reading the first and last sentence of a story and thinking about how they like connect was another interesting way to think about ordering. And that was something I did play with when I was procrastinating and doing other things as we set up the collection.
I wonder if we could talk about Control Negro a little, because I mean, it's such a great story, first of all, but it's also a risky story, and it's a voice that's sort of hard to inhabit. And I know, you know, there are some of the stories in this collection where I was like, am I really gonna write like a satirical story in which someone falls into a volcano? Am I really gonna spend a whole story in the perspective of a white girl in a Confederate flag bikini? But I felt like the story form gave me the space to try it, because I was like, I only have to be in this voice for 20 pages. And if I try it and I think, oh no, I can't ever show anybody this story, it didn't work, I haven't wasted like my whole life. I've just wasted the time it took me to see if it worked. So I guess partly my question is about the story form as a place where you can sort of take risks with with questionable characters or kind of loaded topics. Is that part of why you're drawn to the forum? Is that part of what let you get at some of these kind of riskier stories? And then I guess that's enough questions. I sometimes ask 5 questions at once. So I'm gonna ask that one first and then I have a follow-up
Yeah,
question.
no, I think so, absolutely. I think for me, I mean, again, I love the brevity of short stories. I love the compression, and I love it as a reader because I'm a slow reader and I like to be able to take in the whole story in one place, but I really appreciate it as a writer as well, because like you said, I've written novel drafts before and it's just, you're in it for so long and it's hard for me to even know what I have or what it could be. You know, years in, you're like, is this something? What am I asking? And that's, you know, it's a challenge. So I would say yes, I would say that the brevity of it allowed me to inhabit a space that wasn't mine. And there's a weird way in which that character could be, I'm so different from that character that we're unrecognizable. And yet I had to draw on things that were a more, you know, in the story, for those of you who haven't read it, there's a professor, Cornelius Adams, a father who is basically testing America's promise by running kind of a secret clandestine experiment on his son, and kind of wondering if his Black son is so perfect, if he can basically enjoy the same privileges of his students, which he calls ACMs, average American Caucasian males. But at any rate, but there's a way in which, in a much like very twisted, turned around way, I think as a parent, there is that impulse to protect your child. There's that impulse to wonder if the world can give your child, you know, what kind of chance your child is going to get. And so those normal things just can become very perverse or be turned inside out within a story. You can take something that's very relatable and kind of play with it in this, you know, this extreme way. And I think the extremeness in stories can get at something that feels true and just reasonable. I mean, I think when you read things that are exaggerated just to get to that level of where you can relate to them the way they exist in the real world. I don't know. How about you? Do you think that you're more, does the short story form allow you to be a little bit more take risk? You were talking about the story in Best American, the bikini Confederate flag girl.
Yeah, I think I originally thought that that was going to be part of a novel that would have 4 point of view characters. And I realized I was really interested in that voice. And I think that I thought that I could get it all in that voice, because part of what's interesting in a story is always the way that you have to see around the point of view, because so much of the work of a story is off the page, that I felt like it was a sort of challenge to commit myself to that character's point of view, but to also make it clear the ways in which I was asking the reader to read around her perspective. And I think that's sort of one of the ways a short story almost feels like a logic puzzle to me, that you're always trying to figure out what to leave out and how to get the reader to notice what's not on the page. I think we're almost at Q&A time, so maybe I will wrap this up and stop here and let Clarence come back. But I think I'm curious in your work, because I think it's also so deeply about race and performance, that one of the ways I think about that sort of subterranean space, or that space that's off the page, is in terms of the way that the gap between our interior lives and our exterior lives, which I think is like the heart of all fiction, no matter what you're writing about, that part of what creates a narrative possibility or the capacity for surprise. The reason we don't know exactly what people are going to do is because they're capable of wanting one thing but doing something else, or saying one thing but meaning another. And that is what generates tension in all stories. But I think when I'm writing characters whose exterior performance has to be aware of double consciousness or a male gaze, or some way in which people are taught to step outside of themselves and see what they look like, or taught to perform in particular ways to guarantee their safety or to let themselves be heard, that those kind of structural rules of the world become intimately a part of characterization, right? The way that people are responding, sometimes explicitly, but often implicitly, to the way the world is demanding things of them, or the way that other people have the structural power to kind of command a performance from them, and the way that that impacts what all of us have, which is sort of a tension between what we feel like we can say out loud and what we're experiencing inside, becomes part of that underworld of the story, right? It becomes part of the underneath the story is the ways that you have to notice structural power. And so I think that in order to write about intimate things, I am always writing about power, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly. And I see the same kind of themes in your work. So I wonder if those questions come into your mind consciously as a writer, or if they're just things that emerge from the sort of natural circumstances of the characters that you're writing.
I think they emerge, but I think then I have to go back and, push around them and think about them and see what comes forward. And also, can I come sit in your class and just listen to you talk about writing and stories? Every time I come to a Zoom and get to see you speak, and when I saw you at Tin House and when I got to interview you so long ago when you were here in Charlottesville, I'm always just in awe of your intellect and your I just think you're.
Well, I was so excited we at least got to meet in person all those years ago, and I hope that at some point we can do this. Although I'm so glad we're able to do it at all, but I hope at some point we can do this in person back at home.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Danielle and Jocelyn. A wonderful conversation. I enjoyed listening to both of you, and I liked your insight about the short story form and some of the things that inspired you. We're going to go to the Q&As now, and some of the questions I had, some of these people have already asked. And this is a question for both of you. Michelle Littlejohn asked, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, either Michelle or Michelle Littlejohn, wants to know, how do you continue to work on a project? Have you ever quit for a while and then come back to it?
That could be my cousin, Michelle. I'm just saying. I think it might be. Hi, Michelle, if that's you out there. So do you mind if I go first, Danielle? Sorry, I jumped in there. I got excited. So absolutely. Well, so I tried, because I work full time, because I was working full time while I wrote this collection and for most of my writing career, I have to really think about finding a time when I can get a draft out. Just like Danielle said, it's really helpful, I think, to get like one full draft of something while you're in that space, because often if you take a break, you come back and you've changed, the world's changed, and it kind of starts to morph into a different story, and you kind of want to get it contained in one space before you go back and edit. So for me, I really use the summers. I always try to go take a workshop, or I write really short things. I mean, I think part of the reason I love the short story is because you can, write for a weekend and get a draft out. And then you can put it away. And then it can be really, I think, helpful, at least for me, to go back, put it away, and then look at it and see what emerges and see what it is and see what it means, and then edit it, as opposed to trying to write it in a lot of different pieces, especially for a short story. So yes, I do take breaks, but I try to take them in between drafts, and that's kind of how I go about it. How about you, Danielle?
Yeah, I think my process is similar, that I try to get a first draft done. And I think there are things that I never get to the end of the first draft on, but if I've gotten to the end of a first draft, it may take me a while, but I will usually finish it because I cared enough to get to the center of it. So then it's just a matter of kind of excavation. But sometimes that revision process is like a ship of Theseus revision process, where by the end of it, you have an entirely different story that resembles the original idea of the story. But sometimes it's less dramatic if I have a kind of clarity about the ending once I get to the end of it. But if I'm going to abandon something entirely, it's usually early on. It's usually because I can't get past like page 3.
Page 3. Evangeline Ivy wants to know, do you outline your short stories and novellas before you begin That's a question for both of you.
I'm trying to be an outliner. And again, everything I say about process is like my process. I think people do things all kinds of ways. And if it gets you to the place you need to go, you should work in the way that works for you. I can't outline because I think that part of what I have to do is be surprised by the end of a first draft, is what I've realized. I think that I want to be the first reader who's surprised. And so I tend to write to the first place where there's a question, right? I tend to write to the first place where somebody has to make a choice. And that's maybe a version of outlining, but it's outlining while drafting. I sort of, if I feel completely lost in the story, I'll think like, where's the next time in the story someone has to make a decision? And then I will try to write myself just to that point, but allow myself the surprise of seeing how that decision goes to get to the next place. And I don't try to figure out what I've done until after I've done it. Sometimes I do outline a finished story. If something feels off, but I'm not sure what it is, sometimes outlining what I've done can help me see if I've sort of duplicated work or if something's missing or if the balance of the story is somehow off. But I can't outline ahead of time. It's something I do kind of retroactively.
I think I'm really similar in that there's an element of not knowing or an energy of like, I know this is often I have this kind of beginning inciting idea and this character in a predicament, but then not knowing what's going to happen next, which I think creates more excitement in the text for me. I've written novels and I've tried to really plan out, and I find that I just end up not doing that. It can be helpful, it can be fun to think about and to, kind of place something to be in contact with, right? So it's like just another like agitating piece. You're like trying to write towards this, but then the story can go where it wants to anyway. I think so in one sense, even when I outline, I don't hold myself to it. But for shorter pieces, I really like to just go, I don't know why, but that just feels right to me. It feels comfortable and it feels interesting. And it is interesting. You kind of are starting, I think of it almost like, I don't know, this isn't very inspired, but rolling a snowball down a hill, like you feel like this growing energy, things are getting kind of drawn into it and it's becoming what it's going to become. And then definitely for me, the meaning comes last, like knowing what it is or seeing what it is or seeing a glimpse of what it is, and then going back and finding the pieces that fit with that and maybe pulling away the things that aren't working with that. So for me, outlining is kind of a tangent to the side, not really the path that I follow.
Both of you spoke about the familiarity of the geographical spaces in which you place your stories. Dr. Green asked, to what extent are your short stories autobiographical?
Do you want, I'll go first. I mean, there's a way in which, you only have your own mind, you only have your own observations, you only have yourself to draw from. So, everything has some basis in your own imagination, but I tend to not really write myself. I mean, I don't know what it is. I tend to really resist writing characters that are really feel like me internally or externally. And I don't know if it's just more interesting to inhabit these other spaces or if, I don't know why that is, but yeah, I don't tend to write a lot of autobiography. How about you, Danielle?
Yeah, I think in the same way that I want to be surprised if I sort of already know exactly what happened or I already know exactly what I would do, then there's no kind of surprise there. And so usually I don't want to sort of get literally close to the truth in any way. I do think sometimes things that have happened can be a point of departure, in that I think that one of the things that I once heard Tyree Jones say, if you know what it feels like to be trapped in an elevator, you can write about being trapped in a spaceship, right? And so sometimes I think that that's the process of fiction, right? You're raising the stakes and you're putting all the bells and whistles on things and you're changing the circumstances. But what has to ring true is the feeling. And I think that that's what we're accessing, right? We're accessing our own experience of the world. So I might not have ever experienced anything like the plot, right? But I know what it feels like to have regret, or I know what it feels like to kind of live around grief, or I know what it feels like to experience betrayal or to feel like you betrayed somebody, right? And so I'm accessing that feeling, but I'm putting it in an entirely different context with different stakes. Or sometimes you sort of, or at least I know that I sometimes write in a way where you experience a kind of near miss or a moment in your real life where you don't want the drama, right, of a short story. Like you never want to be living in a short story. It's really like usually not a conducive environment to thriving. So, but I think sometimes you see the thing that could have happened and it's fun to sit down and kind of write your way into, but what if somebody hadn't like deflected that? What if somebody had made a less reasonable decision? What if you sort of, in a circumstances where you dialed something down for the sake of your own kind of reputation or survival, dialed it up instead. And so sometimes I think fiction can come from life in that way. But yeah, I mean, I think if I have the deepest admiration for nonfiction writers, but I don't know how they do it.
It's funny because it feels vulnerable enough, I think, even to write a fiction, because there's still this way in which it feels like readers are walking around in your thoughts, at least for me, having not published anything before and publishing my first thing now, I'm just recognizing and having kind of a new admiration for, you know, writers, all writers, and certainly for nonfiction writers who put themselves out there, because there's a way in which people feel like they know you, and they do know you in this weird way, if they've read the things you're thinking about.
A collection is an especially weird space because it is like handing someone a map of your brain, like not necessarily any facts about you or your biography, but a map of all your obsessions, some of which you're not even aware of until there are 6 gift shops in my collection. I didn't know that.
I noticed I was like,
so there are these things that sort of come up over and over again, and you have to hear about them from readers. But you know, free therapy. You learn a new obsession every event.
Joyce Russell asked, she said she loved your readings. She wants to know, who were your literary influences?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of thinking specifically about the short story, I think that right now the short story is kind of in the era of Edward P. Jones and Alice Munro, who I think are just kind of magicians with time, right? That sort of layering and density that I think about, that sort of framework where like you think you're in one kind of story and then the story just kind of drops into its other level. I think they're both just kind of masters of that. And so I think I went to school at the tail end of kind of minimalism. And I think that right now we're in an era of kind of the maximal short story. I don't necessarily mean maximal in terms of length. I mean maximal in terms of density and capacity, and pushing the boundaries of what the form can do, where you're not necessarily just getting like a stripped down kind of window of life, but you're getting something that maybe isn't flashy in its kind of framing. I mean, it could be, but is just kind of like, if you tried to diagram it, it would be chaos, but somehow it works because of the smoothness of the voice and the sort of the way that everything kind of circles back thematically. So I think that those are the people that I get super excited about when I think about form. I think also in terms of early influences and collections, I loved Z.Z. Packer's collection, Victor LaValle's story collections, Slapboxing with Jesus, Z.Z. Packer's Drinking Coffee Elsewhere, Jim Lahiri's Unaccustomed Earth. Like those are books that I sort of come back to that I think just as an experience of reading kind of makes sense to me as you move through them. And sometimes I think I talk about short stories so much that people think I don't read novels. I love novels. I am teaching some of my favorite novels this semester because I'm teaching a class on omniscience and collage and polyphony and all of these sort of very complicated maximal novel forms. And I think I like things that are maximal. And so when a novel feels like it only has a sort of small lane, I just want it to be a short story. When a novel feels like it's doing 25 different things, and I'm trying to figure out how, then I'm kind of in it. And so, you know, I love Toni Morrison and Colson Whitehead, and I'm teaching Sister Carrie next week. I'm teaching Dreiser, you know, these sort of novels that contain more than you think they can. Virginia Woolf, like this sort of the density of something where I sit back and I read it and think like, how did we move from there to there? Like, how were we just, in one paragraph, we were in a busy London shopping spree, and then we were in the post-apocalyptic London where all of the shoppers were bones beneath the street. And then we were back in the shopping street. Like, how did Virginia Woolf do that? And so I think I appreciate a voice that somehow has that movement that surprises me but feels correct.
I thought I was muted, so I'm not. Yeah, so you mentioned, I'm just going to go all over the place. So I'm not an academic. I didn't even get an MFA, but I definitely just read. I just kind of read from one thing to another. So some people that were really formative in the beginning are things that I think about. Of course, Toni Morrison, Beloved was one of those books that really blew my mind, especially because it was taking this idea, I mean, all of her novels, but that was the first one I read, of something obscene and making it into art, and making such fully realized people, and taking a really surreal concept of this child, this ghost, but making it feel so natural in the world. And there's something I really like about that. I think a lot of the work that I'm drawn to has some sort of, I don't know if hybridity is the right word, but you're kind of pulling two things together that don't feel like they go together, but seamlessly. So a contemporary author I really admire is Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, Friday Black. Just thinking about grief and race and consumerism and placing these things, you know, I read the story Black Friday Friday Black on Black Friday, and this idea of, you know, almost like a zombie-like consumerism. It's just so interesting and just so surprising to me, just that someone would put something together in that way. I was thinking too of Lost in the City, Edward P. Jones, and just almost like a view of a place through all these multiple views. So this connection, this kind of sense of stories that relate together. Or a writer like Nafisi Thompson Spires. I loved her, the collection, her story collection, Heads of the Colored People, in the way the stories talk to one another, but also stand alone. I always think it's interesting to think about how, you know, these characters recur throughout something, and yet the stories are contained unto themselves. I'm just gonna stop there. I could just list writers that I like.
I'm almost certain that a lot of the audience, well, some of the audience members are budding writers. The next two questions sound like they come from writers. Carolyn Holland asks, she says, Danielle asked a question that intrigued me. How do you get the reader to notice what's not on the page? Please advise.
I guess it's my question, so I have to try to answer it first. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things I think about is where are we seeing around the narration? And because I don't know who the reader is, sometimes there are places where you have to risk being misunderstood, right? Because you don't want to explain the whole thing. And so you have to risk that there may be a reader who isn't gonna see the thing. And so I don't think you have to feel like you've prepared for all eventualities. I don't think you have to write to kind of the least aware, least engaged reader. I think you can sort of trust yourself and trust your audience enough to leave some of those spaces and have confidence in the work that you've done. But I think that within that sort of giving yourself permission to be misunderstood, or to not like be so afraid of being misunderstood that you don't write the thing you want to write, I think that there are places where you can put pressure on the perspective. So sometimes it's another character comes in and says something. And so it might be that we're in someone's head and they sound pretty reasonable, and then somebody else comes in and says the opposite. And they sound reasonable too. And suddenly the reader realizes they have to sort of make a decision or use their own kind of intuitive judgment. Sometimes it's a question of the way that a story unfolds, that you can see what it's withholding. And so usually I think about there being a place in the story where it breaks open, right? Where some of what's underneath comes to the surface. And it's not going to be everything, but it's enough to suggest what that narrator or point of view character hasn't been looking at or hasn't been telling you until then. And that can suggest to somebody else where those other gaps are. And then I think a lot of them are in that gap I talked about earlier between our interior experience and our exterior experience. So you don't have to point it out every time somebody is lying. But I think lying is always interesting in fiction, because like, who are they lying to and why, right? Like, who is this for? What is the basis of this lie? And I think that's the kind of space where you can understand something about the structural world of the story without it being explicit on the page. Who does this person want to please? Who are they afraid of? Whose judgment do they fear, or are they courting? And a lie tells you that, right? Sometimes a choice tells you that. But I think that sometimes the structural power dynamics of a story, or the things that a narrator or point of view character cares about, are evident just by kind of where that gap between what they want and what they say, or what they want to do and what they actually do, makes it into the story. That's one of those places where you can sort of see off the page too.
Those are such good answers. I'm not gonna add too much more, but the only thing I thought of when you were talking about, you know, this kind of subterranean thing that maybe you just have a glimpse of, I think in some stories that I like, the space is held with an image of something else, and you know that a question's been asked or you've been told to look at something, but then there's this other thing that you're looking at, and it just creates a moment where you, as you're experiencing whatever that sensation is or whatever that visual is, it's calling you to reflect on the thing that you were kind of pointed to earlier. And I think that can be really satisfying in a story and something to play with.
Z
I think also,
Dempster. I'm sorry, go ahead.
just hearing you say that, I think also sometimes the action itself can echo, right? There's this concept called rhyming action, is when something happens early in a story and then something similar happens later in the story. And the difference between how those two things play out tells you something, right? And so sometimes that's a space of gesturing toward what's off the page, kind of what's changed between those two situations for the character or for their circumstances, that those two similar situations have different outcomes.
Z Dempster asked, have you ever worked on more than one unrelated project at a time? If yes, how do you manage it?
I tend to try to do it in chunks. So I think if I finish a story draft, like hasn't happened in a little while, but if I'm really in that place, I think there's a way that your brain can get into a fiction place, so that if you write something, all of a sudden you have all these ideas and all these things that you want to write at once, which is a really happy place, but doesn't always happen. And so sometimes when that happens, I'll try to get to like a stopping place where something's kind of on hold, not so much because I don't know what to do with it, but I've kind of finished a piece of it, kind of like Danielle was saying earlier, I've gotten to like the next question or the space where it can hold, and then it would be okay to do something else. And what's interesting is I think, first of all, that can be really fun if you're in that place where you're generating a lot of stuff, but I do think it makes sure things kind of speak to each other, or one thing bounces off another, and then you get to a stopping place in that and you can go back to the other thing. So I think that can work, but I kind of prefer to get one thing in a really nice spot before I like move to something else. I don't know, I don't really jump back and forth just, you know, in the moment. It has to be kind of more thoughtful than that. How about you, Danielle?
Yeah, I think that when I've tried to work on more than one thing at once, generally it's been that I was uninterested in one of the things. And so the other project quickly became the real project, that sort of my energy was redirected elsewhere. And then I realized that that's actually where the work was. I know some people do, and I think that some people like have a project that they've finished and another, like a project that they're sort of in draft phase on and a project that they're revising. I don't think my brain works that way. I think I'm a little bit obsessive. And so I need to sort of be laser focused on a thing until I can move on from it and leave it alone for a while. So sometimes I am like, something isn't finished, but it's in a finished draft and it's sitting somewhere while I start something new for a long time until I'm ready to go back to the thing and try to figure out what I can do to revise it. But most of the time I try to see something through as far as I can get it. And then if it's still not working and I have to put it away for a while, I might start something else. Or I might realize if I'm really working on two things at once, often it turns out they're the same thing. I think that half of being a writer is just constantly being outsmarted by your own subconscious, which is directing you toward where the work actually is, in spite of all your attempts to evade it.
Danielle, do you get ideas? Do ideas come to you? Like, do you pose a question and then like much later doing something else, does it come to you sometimes? The answer to it. In other words, if you're like stuck in a place, does that ever, I don't know. I was just curious.
Sometimes, I mean, I think sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I write what I think are solutions to fictional problems in my notes app, and then sometimes they're not as illuminating as I thought they were the next morning. Like my middle of the night shorthand is not what it should be. So 50-50 whether that illumination actually makes it into the story itself.
Jocelyn, you mentioned something earlier about talking about writing a beginning of a sentence, a beginning sentence and an ending sentence, and how you connect the two. This next question comes from Sarah Harrigan. She says, do you ever have the beginning and ending, but not the middle? What do you do to get to the middle? I think that's a question for both of you.
I think for me, I just have a bad middle. Like I always have a middle. There's something happened, but sometimes, especially I think because I don't know exactly where it's going, or it's more interesting for me to write without knowing exactly what's going to happen at the end. I don't really write an end. I write through the whole thing and then I arrive at the end. And so because I want a story to have that energy where the end is kind of building and it's that snowball going down the hill and all of a sudden it is what it's going to be, and you see that. So I don't know what it is. And then once I know what it is, I have to go back, and sometimes I have to go back and say, well, what earns that ending? What's going to make that actually work, and be satisfying to the reader, and to make those intermediate steps believable. I mean, I think that happens to me. That's more off, that's a lot of the editing is thinking about that, because often my subconscious will go back to that beginning and pull things from it for the ending, but just the middle it can be more challenging for me.
Yeah, I think I often rewrite the middle of the story entirely, but I can't get to the ending until it's there. And then sometimes I get to the ending and understand the story is about something entirely different than I thought that it was about. And so the middle gets some sort of serious revision work, or often just thinking about the balance between scene and exposition and that space in between. So sometimes you've either overwritten or underwritten the middle of the story and have to go back and expand or condense accordingly. But rarely can I get to the ending without going through the middle, because I have to sort of figure out where the story is before I can get to the end of it.
Andrea Greer asked, what comes first when you write a story, the character or the plot? Or in your case, characters?
It depends. I don't know what it's like for you, Jocelyn, but I feel like every story is its own process. So I think more often than not, it's probably character over plot. Sometimes it's place, or sometimes it's just voice, and I don't even know how to attach the voice to the character until I've sort of written into the voice for a little bit to figure out who's talking to me. But occasionally I do have like an event, and then I have to think backwards and say, well, basically, how would this happen, right? Sometimes you think about the series of choices that it takes to create a scenario, and you have to imagine the character who would make all of those choices, or the circumstances that would have to precede the decisions they'd have to make to end up in whatever chaos that the plot demands. So occasionally I do start from event and work backwards, but more often than not, I start with voice or image and have to write my way into the plot that's surrounding it.
I think that I similarly start with not so much the whole character, but some voice, some bit of character that kind of is the seed for what that character is going to be. And then sometimes the predicament, just, a parent who's yelling in the office at the secretary because their kid is, where's it, just some moment of tension. And then I have to build around it what's going to come from there. And I often don't know. And in fact, I think it's been interesting to think about plot, because I'm not so interested in plot. I'm not interested in a lot of things happening, but more the interior life of how people feel about what's happening. And I often think that my husband jokes that nothing ever happens in my nothing ever happens in my stories. I think I've learned to make more happen. I think it is fun to have things happening and have people in conflict with one another and in connection, connecting to one another. But I will say that you can have something really small happen and have it feel really big. And I tend to like stories where that's true, where being inside someone's brain is one of the pleasures of reading for me, and seeing how someone feels about it and seeing the difference between how they act and what they're thinking. That piece that Danielle's talked about a bunch of different ways. So yeah, the plot kind of comes last. I'm like, what can I do from here? What might happen? And kind of go from there.
George DeFord asked, what amount of research plays in developing your short stories?
It depends on the story. And I think that, I think in this new collection, the most research for the novella, because it's about a historian. But I also found that a lot of what I wanted wasn't recorded. And that was kind of the point, right? Like I went through the archives of the Milwaukee NAACP for like 2 decades. And it's sort of, at some point someone microfiched them, which is great, but it's just a kind of really random selection of documents. It's not like a curated kind of narrative, right? There are gaps sometimes for years. There are meetings where there are minutes and meetings for which there are not. There are letter threads where you have like half of the correspondence, but not the other half. And so you can infer things from that. And there's some really interesting inferences I could make. But some of what I was actually looking for wasn't documented, right? I had to go to less formal histories. I had to go to, someone did an oral history project of Black families in Madison, which wasn't quite what I was looking for, but it gave me more of what I wanted than the sort of archives to the city that I was looking at, because someone had bothered to record voices, right? Someone had bothered to kind of get people's stories in their own timeline. There's a Black paper from the period I needed that was publishing during the year that I needed, but the archive skipped some years, right? Because at some point someone was like, oh, we should have archived this, but they didn't do it in time to get all the copies in chronological order. So there are gaps in that record. And so because I was writing about history, and history is a kind of storytelling, and history is also a kind of performance, right? History is also about the difference between the story we're telling and the truth, that I feel like in a different kind of project, I would have had to do a lot more archival work or oral history myself to fill in those gaps. What I did in this story was think about what they allowed in terms of the spaces where someone couldn't or wouldn't know the answer to a question, and in what ways the interpretation of those missing pieces, or in what ways the sort of lies about those missing pieces could inform or create anxiety in the present of the story.
I know we're almost out of time, but so I'll just really quickly say that I tend to not write stories where you need a lot of research, but I did actually have to do a bunch of research for the novella because it takes place in Thomas Jefferson's plantation home, Monticello. But what's nice about it was, because it's a contemporary story, the characters know Monticello as it is now, and the main character knows her family story. She knows Monticello as a docent. She knows what you would hear, the stories Monticello tells itself. So I could really draw on the experiences of physically being there and the space, and also the stories that Monticello tells itself and how those have changed. So that was much more interesting for me as far as research. And it was so.
Well, we have time. There are lots of questions, but we have time for one more. This is from author Donna Hill. Donna asks, what would you say are the elemental components of a short story, the building blocks that separates it from a novel?
Oh, I'm so giving this to Danielle, Professor Danielle.
I think for any role that I can make about anything, somebody has broken it in an interesting way. But I think about a short story as being interested in a before and after, and that doesn't have to be didactic, right? It doesn't have to be a before and after that the characters even recognize that they're in. But I think of a short story as somewhere in it having a pressure point after which something was different. It doesn't have to be a dramatic thing, but I think that's how I tend to think about story. And sometimes the before and after is a window of possibility, right? I mean, I think there's also a kind of story where the heartbreak is that something didn't change or didn't happen, where if you give the reader enough to invest in possibility, it can be really, I don't know if satisfying is the right word because it's usually depressing, but satisfying in a depressing way, that there hasn't been transformation, right? That a moment of possibility closed. But I think that what I'm looking for is that sort of window that either closes or that somebody goes through, and something is different whether or not the people in the story can tell you that.
I love what you said, because to me, it just gets at that idea of change. I mean, something has to, for a story to matter, for something to have happened, something has to change, or the possibility of change has to exist on the page, some pressure of change. So I think that makes a lot of sense to me.
Well, I want to thank you, Danielle. I want to thank you, Jocelyn, for joining us. This has been a fantastic program and a wonderful conversation that you've brought to our audience. I want to thank my colleagues at the Center for Black Literature. Thank you, Dr. Green, April, Simone, and Leah, and Amber. And I also want to thank the audience for attending. I want to ask everyone to please fill out the survey that'll pop up on your screen, or it already has popped up on your screen. I also want to encourage you to visit our website, www.centerforblackLiterature.org, to be updated about some of our upcoming programs. Also encourage you to visit aalbc.com, which is the oldest and largest Black-owned online bookstore. So you can purchase books by both Jocelyn and Danielle there. And also visit the Center for Black Literature website. And if you liked our program and you want us to continue with our free programs, please consider making a donation. No donation is too large, no donation is too small. I really appreciate having both of you here. I had questions of my own. I'm not going to spoil it because I was talking to Jocelyn earlier about her story, and Danielle had a question for you too, but I won't give any spoilers out. But again, I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank you for joining us. The best of luck to you all. Continue with your writing. Oh, and congratulations, Jocelyn. I think, is it Netflix or something like that?
The novella, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
Congratulations. Congratulations to you. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful evening and continue reading the works of Jocelyn and Danielle. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.